Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So glad you can all be here. As everyone gets joined in here, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. If you want to put your name and where you're located, and if you'd like the organization that you're affiliated with, then we can get a sense of who's joining us today. Well, welcome everyone. We were excited to see so much interest in this conversation about participatory evaluation. We had over 200 people register for this conversation, which we were excited to see. And so I wanted to just take a moment to give a little bit of information about who we are and how we got here today, because I know this event was also shared on LinkedIn, and so you might not be familiar with the participatory grant-making community. But my name's Kelly Buells, and I'm a practitioner of participatory grant-making, and I've been working with the participatory grant-making community since we started in 2020. And we are a global community of practice that's working to share knowledge and practice around participatory grant making, and it encourages its use within philanthropy. I think we have over 2,000 people engaged in our community, which is really exciting, from over 70 countries, I believe. So if you are new to us, I invite you to check out our website. We have resource pages. We have a YouTube channel where we capture sessions like this to hopefully speed the transition of power to communities in philanthropy. And on the main page of our website, you can sign up for our Google group listserv, our Slack channel, and you can also sign up for our newsletter to stay updated on the community. And yeah, this conversation actually came out of a conversation that was happening on our Google group listserv. And we had just a ton of people who were interested in learning about participatory ways for evaluating participatory processes. And we had two community members who offered to share what they're learning in this realm. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Olga Rychkova with the Robert Carr Fund and Shama Dossa from Fenomenal Funds. So Olga, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. First of all, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for hosting Participatory Grant Making Community. And thank you for everybody who joined us today. I'm just really encouraged by so much interest. I am a senior program officer with the Robert Carr Fund, which is a participatory grant maker from day one. We were set up and established as a participatory grant maker. And we are participatory in everything that we do, not just the funding decisions and kind of grant-making process itself, but also everything that comes around, including our monitoring and evaluation for learning processes. Yeah, we will talk about it more in a minute, so I'll probably I will end my introduction here.
Thanks, and Shama.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Shama Dossa, and I'm a learning practitioner with Fenomenal Funds. I have been there as the Feminist Learning and Evaluation Manager for about 3 years. And prior to that, I've experienced working in Afghanistan with the Al Khan Foundation as well. I work in participatory approaches, feminist research methods, as well as adult learning and arts-informed research. And currently, I'm based in calling in from Karachi, Pakistan today. And so that's a little bit about me. And I also teach learning and evaluation. So.
Wonderful. Great. So for our time today, we're going to give a chance for Shama and Olga each to just share a little bit about the frameworks and the processes that they're using. And then we're going to do some Q&A. So as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will try to collect them and get them answered. We also are recording this, so it will be up on our YouTube channel in the future if you want to share it. So yeah, I guess without further ado, Shama, do you want to take some time to share more about your work?
Sure. Thank you very much, PGM Community, for including Phenomenal Funds here to talk a little bit about our learning. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So just, that's the right screen. Okay. And hoping everybody can see my screen. And so, yeah, so I'll start a little bit by sharing a bit of the overview of the presentation today. I'll talk a little bit about Phenomenal Funds shared governance model and our learning strategy, and then a little bit about our learning partners and our learning plan, and also some emerging learning, depending on how much time we have. So I'll see how that works for us. So first of all, I just want to start with an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement is to a lot of the people that have made it possible for us to have this type of knowledge that I'm going to share today, starting with the Women's Funds. So Phenomenal Funds is a feminist funder collaborative, and we work with women's funds who are members of the Prospera International Network of Women's Funds, so the INWF. And we also are funded by 4 US-based private philanthropy foundations, private foundations, and we are supported by the Prospera Secretariat. And we basically have a very small staff. I'm the only learning and evaluation person there, who basically hold the space for a lot of this work. But we are supported by many, many brilliant feminists as well. So just to start, our vision for feminist funding is to think a little bit about it from the point of view of equal power, a decolonizing environment. We want to see the ecosystem being democratic, connected, abundant. Resource justice is definitely at the center of our conversation, as is the concept of resilience. And so our model to start with for our participatory grant making is connected to a couple of things. So the first one is we pool our funding. So the money that comes in for Phenomenal Funds goes into a pooled fund, which allows us to not have the type of funding restrictions that individual funders may put on the type of money that they're giving. So it gives us a little bit more leeway. We have a participatory grant making model, and if people are interested in hearing more about it, you can definitely go to our grant our page and you can have a look at that. And we have a shared governance model, which is very important to the work we do. And our idea is to essentially go through 2 grant making streams. We have these resilience grants and the collaboration grants to be able to resource the feminist funding infrastructure. So I'll start by sort of framing how learning and evaluation is set up at Phenomenal Funds. And that comes from guidance from our governing body. And our governing body is made up of women's funds who are the recipients of the resources and the funding partners. So we have a 4 and 4 sort of combination that allows for the steering committee to have elected members of women's funds and 4 representatives of the funding partners. So this steering committee essentially gave guidance initially where they said that learning needs to be integrated into the implementation of the model. They were not interested in evaluation being something that happens at the end, but something that really happens and is integrated into the learning that we're doing at the moment. So learning in real time. The process needs to create spaces for engagement and sense making, bringing women's funds and the governing bodies together at key points. And that's really important. To have a clear distinction also in the group that's a learning partner, who's so an external group that brings support to us, and our own learning and evaluation work internally. And also that we are not going to wait till the end, as I said, to capture results or outcomes, but we want to learn in real time. So this is an important thing. And then, of course, we would want to incorporate a feminist lens, and the process needs to be adaptive, emergent, and participatory. So with that guidance, we began to think about how do we implement these principles in practice? So today's conversation is really about the application of these principles. And so that's always a challenging part. We have a lot of great ideas around feminist learning and evaluation, but the challenge people mostly face is around how do we actually practically make that happen? So we start by asking questions about who are the decision makers? How do we intentionally center learning? What learning questions are asked? How is methodology determined? What does data making look like? How does sense making look like? How is the learning shared? Who determines how knowledge is shared? And how are we held accountable to the values and principles we embrace? So this is initially a timeline to show you how integrated and reflective the process is and how flexible it is too. We started in 2021 really to begin to get that guidance. And then over the period of a year, went through multiple iterations of going back and forth in a very participatory way with the governing body to be able to get representatives of women's funds and the funding partners to sit together to collaborate and think through the process. So we would present ideas and then we would get feedback, present ideas, get feedback. And so that process took us all the way through a year. So this just tells you that participatory learning and evaluation, as everybody here who does it knows, is really resource intensive and time consuming, but that is extremely valuable to create ownership by taking a process that is so engaged and building a framework for learning and evaluation, developing our theory of transformation, getting input from our advisory committee, which is our grant-making body, the broad community of women's funds that we work with, as well as an iterative process of going back and forth. So that's just one part of it. The second thing that we sort of learned as we went along with this process is a need for actually thinking about governance in learning and evaluation. So it's not just shared governance at a decision-making and grant-making level, but actually shared governance for learning and evaluation. So we actually set up a very robust and really, really active working group of our steering committee, which has 2 members of our steering committee, 1 women's fund and 1 from Parrot Philanthropy, 1 external member from the 4 funders who is a learning and evaluation person. We have a member who is a women's fund member, but is a technical person in learning and evaluation. And we also have the secretariat represented in this space. So this group, it actually becomes a really interesting resource and a super supportive space for us to be able to have these very important conversations around decision-making around learning and evaluation. And it's responsible for the guidance on our learning strategy, for hiring of our external evaluators or learning partners, technical support, support on knowledge sharing, as well as recommendations on strategic decisions. So I cannot stress the value of this group, and it's so important to actually have a body and a resource body of technical people that owns the process and is made up of both the grantees, or in our case, the partners, and the stakeholders in Phenomenal Funds. So this entire group was really, really important in creating our learning strategy. And I have to give Lulu Kutolo support, props here for all the images that she's developed. And she's a great designer who's helped us to do this. And our framework essentially brings together the idea of feminist learning and evaluation principles and emergent learning. And emergent learning comes from an idea of looking at the guidance from the working group and the steering committee to see that we want learning in real time. And so it's almost like an action research approach to reflection and action as we are building our strategy and as we are implementing our strategy. So this is what emerged out of this very reflexive process of engaging with the women's funds and the different governing bodies to develop our theory of transformation. And as you can see here, the women's funds are at the center, and you can see collaboration, learning, and sharing at the center of our story. It's really interesting how, because we had a very participatory process of developing this theory of transformation, that you could actually see when we presented it the first time, it was not in this iteration. And the women's funds are the ones who identified that maybe you're jumping too fast, maybe you missed out gaps, maybe you need a transitional level before you talk about how change is going to happen, or how transformation in systems is going to happen. And so this is a culmination of a lot of participatory processes to be able to come to even develop the theory of transformation. Then we also had a really interesting experience with our working group to actually get on board our learning partner kit, which is the Royal Institute in the Netherlands, Tropical Institute in the Netherlands. And I think one of our partners is actually here today. So this was a really interesting process where we had to think about how do we use feminist principles to commission an external evaluator? What would that reflection process look like? How would we assess? How would we engage? How much time do we give? Are we making sure that we don't make the people who are interested in the work do unpaid work? How do we resource the recruitment process? How do we go beyond the usual suspects in terms of getting information out to a larger community beyond LinkedIn? How do we sort of engage with the movement to try and find a learning partner? How can we give preference to people in the global south or people who originate in the global south? How do we bring about language justice in this conversation? What sort of skill sets can we work with? And in that process itself, the methodology began to also emerge. And when we finally got Kit on board, we decided that the way that we wanted to work with a learning plan was to actually co-create it with our stakeholders. And so together we set up a process where we actually had an initial conversation about, what are the curiosities and learning questions? What would be the stakeholders' interest in it? What are the methodologies that are most appropriate for this work? And what are the ethical and safeguarding dimensions of this work? So it was really by getting feedback from our stakeholders that this entire learning plan actually got developed. And that is really the evaluation framework that we're talking about. So just to give you a bit of an idea, this is the broad learning question that we came up with. So what will it take to strengthen the individual infrastructure and collective ecosystem of women's funds? And the core questions that we're really asking are, how have the grants made a difference for women's funds? Are there any signs that the support women's funds do things and practicing that they could not do before? And what changes can be related to Phenomenal Funds participatory grant making? And we are looking more at contribution and not attribution here. So I'll just go ahead to sort of give you an idea of the iterative and reflective process that we're working with at the moment. We're in the middle of it at the moment in terms of how we are engaging with the different stakeholders at Phenomenal Funds, with our learning partners, with the working group, in order to come up with some sort of an idea of what the meaning making for this process looks like. This process is in tandem with our own sort of learning that is coming from Phenomenal Funds internally. And our idea is to then triangulate these two learnings that are coming together. So key takeaways for me in terms of how we would want to talk about learning and evaluation and what we're learning from the process is that learning is about power and the power to define what changes are sought, what data is seen as valid, and who shapes the story and the data tells us, and what lessons will be acted upon. Centering learning needs to be an intentional organizational strategy. It can't be a one-off thing. It can't be separate from it. Resourcing learning and evaluation is an ethical imperative. So it's just not about something that happens at the end. We have to think about it from a time point of view, from an expertise, language justice, accompaniment, flexibility, and creating space for meaning making. Also, feminist principles extend beyond methodology to governance, commissioning, and recruitment. And developing a learning strategy can be a good guidepost for thinking about your approach to evaluation. So having said that, we have a whole bunch of resources that we've developed over the last 2 years. And this includes all of these links that we can share with you if you're interested. There's also material on how do we develop a learning strategy, and also a lot of work on thinking about decolonizing learning and evaluation, if that's of interest for people. So I'll stop there And if people are interested later on, I'm happy to talk a little bit about our internal learning processes and pathways analysis that we're also doing. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I have to say again that the artwork is just so beautiful and does such a wonderful job of telling the story. So thank you, and we'll come back for questions. But now I'm gonna have Olga share about the work of the Robert Carr Fund.
Thank you, and Shama, thank you for such a rich presentation. I definitely see a lot of parallels, but also a lot of things that we do slightly differently. So I will start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. Just to tell you a bit more about who Robert Carr Fund, who we are and what we do, and how our model of not just participatory grant making, but also participatory monitoring and evaluation for learning came about. So very briefly, Robert Carr Fund was named after late Dr. Robert Carr, an academic and an activist from his native Jamaica, who was a tireless advocate for civil society and community role in the HIV response. And he also advocated that for communities to be meaningfully engaged, they also need the resources to do that. And so he was really a tireless advocate for funding for community-led response in the HIV. Robert Carr Fund is focused on community's role in the HIV response. So we have a very kind of defined vision and mission, which is our reason for existence, and our main vision is to really contribute to a strong, vibrant and resilient civil society leading in the HIV response. We're particularly committed to supporting community-led networks in the HIV response. We do that by providing core, long-term, and flexible funding. And here I want to say that the reason that Robert Carr Fund has been providing long-term, core, and flexible funding to the communities and community network in the HIV response is directly linked to our participatory model. The fund was established when both civil society members and donors came together at the decision-making table and decided to establish the fund to cover the critical funding gap for communities. And it was the community participants who insisted on this model of funding, that they were very clear, we don't need project funding, we don't need your 1-year short-term grants, we really need long-term core and flexible funding so we can build our systems, we can build our networks, and we can really be meaningfully engaged and leading in the HIV response because our lives are on the line. So as mentioned, we have participatory funder. We are a pooled funding mechanism, which means that we have several funding partners who pool their funds so that we can then redistribute them to our grantees. And also this is a way for how we can circumvent some of the restrictions that some of the individual donors might have. Our role is, so as mentioned, we provide multi-year flexible co-funding. We do that in a participatory process. Maybe a quick word to say that our grantees are at the center of everything we do. And when we come talk about participatory processes, we do not mean just the grantees' involvement, but also our international steering committee is a governance body where both civil society and community members and funding partners share equal voice. So it's not just transferring power, but also about sharing power. We believe that our funding partners also have a lot to benefit by working together and listening to and learning from our community members. We also have a program advisory panel, which is made up entirely out of civil society members who develop a funding advice, and then our international steering committee basically confirms that funding advice. So this is how the funding decisions are driven by community voices. We as the Secretariat do a lot of work, not just supporting this governance structure, but also making sure that community members and civil society members can meaningfully engage. This is not just having it written into the governance charter, but putting like real systems in place so that the community participation is real. And Shama was talking a little bit about the language justice and other, we definitely make sure that when our community members participate in processes, that they can do it in the language they understand, that we understand that they don't have the same institutional support as some of the funding partners have. So we are, as Secretariat, take responsibility for it. And so that we have like a whole range of steps that we take to make sure that participation is true and real. And again, I'm more than happy to talk about it if there are questions. And then since we're here to talk about monitoring evaluation, I just wanted to say a couple of words about our theory of change. But first, we do use the, in our work, there are so many acronyms and abbreviations. We do say MEL, monitoring and evaluation for learning. And we are very intentional about how we understand it. So we do not monitor and evaluate just on, we're not a police officer trying to see like, is our investment making impact? But we are really learning, we are really monitoring and evaluating what our grantees are doing together so that we can also collectively learn for it. So for a learning component is really, really important. It's not to measure performance or measure impact, although we do want to understand how RCF funding is used and how we can support our grantees better in which areas, and also to understand which issues or challenges they face on the ground. But ultimately, we're also using this tool to report back to our own funding partners and advocate for more resources for community-led HIV response. So our MEL framework and MEL processes serve multiple purposes, and learning is a very important one of them. Support to our partners is another one. And then, of course, also the accountability and ensuring and fundraising. So as mentioned, our theory of change is that in order to be able to influence change or affect change, civil society and community-led networks need to have strong organizational homes. This is where our co-funding comes in. And so by providing by providing core support, so civil society networks can build strong organizations and build their advocacy capacity, then they can influence the situations affecting their communities when it comes to human rights, when it comes to access to and quality of services, not just HIV services, but any other services the community members might need, as well as just improving the resourcing of their community-led HIV response as a whole. And ultimately, we hope that it contributes to better health, inclusion, and well-being of inadequately served populations. And so our MEL framework, when the fund was established, our funding partners we are funded by governments. And so they, of course, also have their own taxpayers they report to. And so the demand for ability to understand what those investments are doing in terms of change on the ground was very strong. But it also was, there was also a need for our grantee partners to understand, what is it, how their work, basically have a tool to take a step back and see what is the bigger impact of their work than just day-to-day advocacies that they're doing, to offer them a bigger picture, essentially, not just of their own work, but also what we are achieving as a collective. We often refer to RCF as not as a fund but we really talk about RCF family or RCF collective, because we really feel that it's really the collective power of Robert Carr Fund grantees that is contributing to the bigger change in the world. And so part of the desire for this MEL framework was to be able to capture it at the level of the collective and not only at the level of individual grantees. And so the MEL framework, the theory of change and the MEL framework was initially formulated together with a working group of including grantee members as well as our funding partner members. Everything we do really includes all kind of key constituencies that make up the RCF collective. And we measure our results along this kind of 4 main areas. We directly related to the theory of change that I showed, network strength and influence. This is the data we use to really make the argument that without having strong organizational homes, it's really very difficult for civil society and community organizations to make impact when it comes to changing policies and laws that affect their lives. And in order to have strong organizational homes and in order to be strong advocates, you really need core, long-term, and flexible funding. So a lot of data that we collect from together with our grantees about their work falls under this bucket of network strength and influence. And then we also measure their work on human rights, access to and quality of services, and resource accountability. So this framework is really very specific to the main mission of RCF, which is community-led HIV response. But again, it was developed together with our grantees. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen for a minute and just talk a little bit about some of the tools we use. So one of the ways in which kind of the participatory nature of this process happens, not just only at looking at what grantees are doing and how it contributes to the bigger change that we are able to achieve as a collective, is also the tools we are using for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We are using surveys rather than the reports. There are many reasons for it, and there are different experiences the grantees have, of course, but the bottom line is responding to online service questions, ticking the box whether it's yes or no, and maybe providing short comment is much easier for most grantees than writing a lengthy narrative report that a lot of donors want. We also been thinking about some other modalities like interviews, but we have a very large pool of grantees. At the moment, we fund more than 7. We have, at the moment, our portfolio is 72 individual networks, and we have a very small secretariat. So the survey provides a way where we can collect a lot of grantee data in a very user-friendly way without asking grantees to write long reports. At the same time, we are also aware about some challenges that grantees experience with it. You need to have the internet connection. We are not able to collect data in more than one language, so they do need to submit it in English. So this is definitely not a perfect method, but we consistently collect also input from our partners, like what the experience have been and how we can improve it to make the process, easier for them and easier for us as well. And every now and then we have a process of reviewing the MEL framework. Last year, for instance, we again brought a working group of grantees together to look at the MEL framework and look at the tools we use together and to see how can we simplify them, streamline them, make them easier, but also make them more up to date, because the original framework was developed back in 2018. And so it's been more than 5 years. So we really wanted to get their input on how they experience it and how they want to basically bring it more closer to their current realities. Just to see how engaged our grantees are, we issued call for to join the working group to look at the MEL tools. And we had 52, I believe, grantees that stepped forward. So a working group with 52 people is unmanageable, but it was the amount of interest and engagement, I think, really speaks to how the participatory processes really encourage engagement and people are really willing to step in and to contribute. So we regularly ask for feedback. The survey itself, even though it asks a lot about the work that grantees are doing, but it also always asks, what is your feedback towards Robert Carr Fund? What can we do better? What can we improve in the survey? And we do take it seriously, although we also acknowledge some of the technical limitations we face, including ability to process surveys in more than one language. We also use the survey results to develop our annual reports, but also to inform other learning events we do for our partners. We organize annual impact reflection workshop where we bring all our partners together And the topics for discussion are really driven by grantees themselves. We also have kind of a grantee working group that works together with with other members of our CF collective to develop the learning agenda for the collective impact reflection and inform it. And all the sessions are usually peer-led. So we are a secretariat to facilitate and help to bring it together, but the topics for discussion and content is really defined by the grantees themselves. And we also have a roster of online learning events for grantees, which are again peer-led. We haven't had that many events this year yet because we had several transitions at the fund as well, but we hope to pick it up for the end of the year, for later this year. I know we are a little bit coming short on time, so maybe I'll start. I will probably stop here, but there was one thing that I wanted to show you very quickly is this one slide. So one of our main argument is that long-term core and flexible funding is really critical for civil society, for activists to be able to organize and do their work. And so this framework that was developed together with our grantees really help us to capture the importance and the value of long-term core and flexible funding. And here it shows that a lot of change, a lot of advocacy change that our grantees are able to achieve on the ground is really fueled by core funding, much more so than project or activity funding. And so, the data that we collect together with our grantees based on this framework I described really help us both to make it visual and really bring this point to our funders to continue to ensure this type of support is available to civil society and community members and organizations. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Olga. That last slide was so powerful, and I hope everyone knows about the group Funding for Real Change that's advocating for funding general operating and flexible support. So that's such an important piece to share. So yeah, I have some questions I'd love to ask you both, and we seem to be getting lots of great questions in the chat. So I'll start with one that came up in the chat that's also one we had talked about chatting about, which is just how you think about decentering monitoring and instead centering learning. Just because as someone shared in the chat, that monitoring seems like an oxymoron when it comes to feminism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Olga, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. I think this is a very, very important question, an important conversation. I do want to say that we at RCF can definitely, we need to do more and move bridge monitoring and learning closer than we are able to do now. There is a lot of learning that happens through our MELD process, including the last slide that I shared, right? Like we would not be able to advocate we all know in theory that core funding is critical for community-led organizations or civil society organizations, but really getting this data consistently year in for year, and we have more than 5 years of this data, and it's really, really consistent. It really helps to advocate for it, but also for learn, like, what does it actually mean? If we're talking about core funding, like what aspects of it and what way? So there is definitely a lot of learning that happens through it, but also it is also an accountability tool. We receive also core funding from our donors, and we need to report back to them on it. And so the line between learning and monitoring and accountability is quite blurry, I want to say. But again, having a participatory governance system where both donors and civil society and community members come together and have those discussions at the table, I feel this is where the real learning also happens in a way that can influence the practice on the ground. because then our funding partners do not just see it in an annual report, but they actually have this conversation, looking each other in the eye at the table. It's like, well, our theory was this, but I'm now looking at the data and hearing about your experience. We understand that that's what the importance is. And I do want to say it's really, really informs the kind of the continuous evolution of the grant making processes themselves, how to make them more accessible, how to make it more accountable. But the bottom line, indeed, it sometimes can be challenging to keep learning from monitoring like strictly separate, because I think they serve different but adjacent roles. I'll stop here.
Okay, so I think, yeah, you're right when somebody said they didn't hear me talk about monitoring so much, and that's because our focus hasn't been so much on monitoring as much as it has been on accompaniment. I think there is a structure where we do get reporting from our partners, but the reporting is quite different. So we only ask for, we didn't do a baseline, for example, but what we do have is an application process. And the application process, I think, is quite interesting because as I was reflecting I was reading the book. I don't know how many of you read it, but you should if you haven't, which is What's the Point of a Revolution If You Can't Dance? And in that, variant or pitch, they really say that imagine a world where you were invited to submit a proposal instead of having to ask something really simple to let us no more than 2 pages in your own language, a proposal for multi-year core funding, including benefits, pensions, money for security, with an answer within a week, even a month would be extraordinary. Imagine that bliss. That's what Phenomenal Funds has been able to do. So I think that when we look at it, it's not really a monitoring, but it's actually a 2-pager submission. And we keep following up on that in another year, each year. Like we ask people 3 questions. Like, for example, like what would you see as the change, right? And we ask questions like, how has the context influenced your choices or the situation that you've been in? And, what's your plan for the next year? That's about it. It's usually a 2-pager, and it's up to women's funds how they respond to it. They can respond in any language that they're comfortable in, and we cover the cost of the translation if we need the translation. And so that's one part. The second part is we do learning conversations. So Olga talked about a survey. What we do is instead we share maybe 3 questions, and this we've been doing for our collaboration grants, where the group comes together. We, sort of share 3 questions in advance, and then it becomes like an interactive conversation, which we record and then send the recording back to the women's funds, and we then convert it into a report and send it to the funders. So the women's funds don't have to have the weight of actually writing a report. So we're not really so much about monitoring, but the real-time learning that people were asking about happens in these conversations where people are talking to each other and learning from each other and reflecting on their practices, and that becomes the real-time learning as well. There's other real-time learning, for example, because we've been doing like a core flexible long-term funding. So we have like 3 years of different funds talking about what have been their pathways to resilience and change. And so you can do a really interesting pathways analysis, like on real time, basically seeing from 1 year to the next, how those things have shifted. And so what we did is we did like an example of that and shared it with women's funds to get feedback from them, whether that actually resonates with them or it doesn't, or it challenges their understanding. And it was really interesting because women's funds basically are contextual. Some are new, some have been established, some are huge, like Global Fund for Women, and some are tiny, like Women's Fund Armenia, right, in terms of the resources. And their starting points are different. So how do you talk about change in a way that is contextual? A pathways analysis is a great way to do that sort of like learning in real time as well. So that's just another example of how we're doing it. The third piece that I mentioned was accompaniment, and accompaniment is happening at different levels. So we have something called collaboration grants, and we had a collaboration lab, which brings together women's funds to talk about how they want to address issues or organizational strengthening, and they choose their own topic. And we, as Phenomenal Funds, were not in that space. We actually stepped out of that space and asked feminist facilitators to hold space for these groups as they went through a process of coming together, really thinking through on their work, and then moving it into a plan, a learning plan for themselves. And that worked really, that is really interesting. And we will be coming up with a toolkit fairly soon on how we actually did that process. But that holding space also then allowed for women's funds to say, okay, this is moving too slow, this is moving too fast, this is a lot of work, we need to take a break from it. And that feedback we would get from the facilitators. So the monitoring was not happening like, us demanding people tell us something, but actually sharing and reflecting on practice, and then using that to actually change the processes. So as we are giving out grants, we're also learning about how to do grant making at the same time. So that's, again, how learning is happening in practice. After we sort of did the grant making for the collaboration grants, the Women's Funds found that accompaniment process to be so interesting and so important that they actually then ended up hiring these facilitators, not all of them the same ones, but coordinators to hold the space for them to continue the learning as they went on. So that's been a really interesting, again, support mechanism that has moved forward and helped the Women's Funds to actually achieve their goals.
Mm. I see a question from one of the participants about how often are RCF grantees surveyed. So we provide 3-year grants to our grantees. It's always a competitive process. We always have open calls for applications. So we cannot guarantee renewals, but we do have a cohort of grantees that has been with RCF since day one. And so we, at the start of each grant cycle, we do a baseline survey. So we basically ask grantees where they're at that moment. How many staff members do you have? Are you registered as an organization? What is your governance structure? As well as what are you planning to do? Like, are you planning to prioritize human rights in your work? Are you planning to prioritize access to services in your work? So we have a set of baseline questions. And then we, every year, at the end of the year, we essentially ask them to complete what we call annual survey. And so this is where we collect information about from grantees, how the year was for them, what did they do. And then it shows, and then we can compare to the baseline, so we can really tell the story about how 3-year support, what it meant for our partners, but it also helps us to tell the story to our funders that, advocacy is not you push the button, you get the outcome type of story, that it's not linear work. Sometimes you engage in a process and then political context changes or something else happens, and then you have to completely change tack and change your strategy and do something different. So we really try to kind of document through our survey that this non-linear process, and that some advocacy does not necessarily immediately lead to the result, but it still brings value. For instance, because you were able to produce evidence, collect data from communities, or mobilize your community, or provide capacity building to your partners. So we try to document both the amount of effort that goes into the work that our grantees do to make change happen, as well as the change itself, if it does happen. But we do not ask them to say, well, if you conducted this advocacy campaign, then what was the results? So we do not necessarily, we understand that those activities are not necessarily coupled because the reality is much more complex.
Yes, thanks everyone for all the questions coming in the chat, trying to keep up. I actually have one that I just wanted to make sure we make a little space to talk about, which is in participatory processes, there's often something talked about called like the process outcomes. So there's like the outcomes of the grant, but then there's also the outcomes of the participatory process. And I'm just curious, like how you measure or account for those or learn from those, and how that's built into your framework.
In a way, our process outcomes are all the things I talked about. So, for example, the formulation of the working group was a process outcome itself. The formulation of our learning strategy is a process outcome. The formulation of our theory of change is a learning outcome. The process of developing a learning plan itself was an outcome. So these are actually, what we did is we documented them and people can access them on our links. So they are actual outcomes, but they're based on the learning. So they're based on the process and then they emerge as an actual product or an outcome from it. I don't know if that helps respond to your question.
Yeah, for us, it's a little bit similar in a way that a lot of the outcomes that we measure are linked to the model. Like our grantees would not be able to make this progress in their advocacy, for instance, if they did not receive core flexible funding. So by measuring the modality of support and the value that it brings to their work, we're kind of also able to measure the impact of the participatory funding model. Also because this core funding would not be available if not for the participatory model of funding. But as mentioned at the beginning, Robert Carr Fund, most of our funding partners are governments, and governments have a lot of process and requirements that you need to meet. And one way we are using this MEL framework is really kind of to absorb all those requirements and not pass them on to grantees, not to pass on the burden. So we're trying to use this survey as a way to make the process a little bit simpler for grantees, and then we, as the Secretariat, do what's needed to give our funding partners what they need for their own process. So that's but at the same time, we do conduct evaluations of the grant cycle that is separate from our monitoring and evaluation for learning framework on which the grantee surveys are based. And this is where every 3 years we really have an external evaluation done of our grant making process. We committed to supporting community-led networks, like were we successful in it? Is the majority of our grantees community-led, for instance? Or we committed to support networks involved in HIV response globally, but if we are looking at the cohort of our grantees, is it truly a global cohort? So it's really kind of linked to our initial grant-making process. So at the very end, we always bring external evaluators to see whether we were successful in doing what we said we will do. So this is how and this is, again, we do usually at the level of the Secretariat, not to pass on an additional reporting burden to our grantees. However, we do ask grantees if they want to participate in some of the interviews, for instance, in that process. And then again, those interviews are done by external evaluators, so they do not need to worry about the Secretariat or other staff members influencing any of their relationships with the Secretariat.
Thank you. Well, if you can believe it, we're getting short on time. It's been such a rich conversation, and Olga, I know you need to get off right at the top of the hour. So I just wanted to offer if there's anything else you wanted to share or any question that came up in the chat that you wanted to respond to.
Maybe very quickly, there's a question about using these surveys instead of reports to get the data. So we try to make the survey simple. Every grantee gets a link. All they need to do is to click on it, and then we went through different iterations of the survey, and definitely there are grantees that experience it as burdensome. Every grantee has different capacity. For some, it's relatively quick and easy. For others, it takes more time. It also depends on their structure, and so we recognize that the experience is not the same for different partners, even though they all complete the same survey. But what we are trying to do is to really minimize amount of text grantees need to put in by trying to prioritize yes and no questions or select the best version. Multi-choice. That means that the grantee just needs to click the answer that describes the situation best, rather than spend time drafting the text-based reports, for instance. There are, of course, text-based questions. So if we ask them, please describe your advocacy campaign, of course, they need to describe it. But if we are asking it, is this the campaign that you started in last year, or is it a campaign that you started before, just to show, again, to capture the long-term nature of some of this work. Then again, they only need to tick the box whether it started last year or whether it started prior. So we try to use those kind of the technical features of a survey to make it a little bit easier. But as I said, some grantees can only do it from their phone. Others have their full, office set up to do it. Because some of the grantees are really very small, nascent networks, and some are really very well established. So the experience is definitely not uniform. And the one thing we are trying to do is to provide webinars before the start of the survey to explain grantees what it is. We reach out to them often and say, if you have a question, please, this is the person you can talk to. Call me, Alex, I will walk you through if needed. We're offering office hours, so you can hop on a call and essentially complete the survey together with me online. And we do provide translations for our Spanish speakers, Spanish-speaking grantees, because those typically have less access. In our experience from our grantee cohort, that group has less access to translations than some of our other grantees do, or have like less English language capacity than our grantees from other regions. So we try to mitigate it as much as we can, but we are considering multilingual surveys, but at the moment we just, as the Secretariat, do not have the capacity to process surveys in more than one language, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Olga. We really appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom with us today. And Shama, I wanted to give you a chance too to answer any last burning questions.
Sure. There's so many questions actually, and I'm just thinking, there's such great questions. So I think in terms of learning conversations, people asked how many times. So I mentioned we did them once with the collaboration group, but we're also holding space for learning and sharing, where we let the collaboration groups be the ones to hold the space and open it up for learning for the entire network, so they can actually share it, and we document that and also send summaries of that to the group. In the other part, when people asked, what are some of the assumptions that are coming up or being challenged when we started doing this work? And I think what was really interesting is we thought all the women's funds knew each other because they're part of this close-knit network. But when we got them together, we realized that most people didn't know each other. And because they're from such diverse backgrounds, time zones, and languages, it takes a lot more time to actually build trust and learning in a space. And that needs to be supported and facilitated. So we had to slow down on our grant making process for that particular reason. And so all of this learning came in real time for us to actually adapt and adjust our grant making process. We also have an advisory committee that is made up of 6 of the women's funds. Is it 6 women's funds and two of the grant making partners, and they also provide sort of supportive advice on reviewing the grant applications. So it's not like you won't get a grant if you don't follow these instructions, but more like, here's some great ideas to think about, and you will get the grant. So we have a non-competitive grant making process, which is also quite interesting. So everybody who applies for the grant who's a member of the network will get the grant, which I think is very cool. It's not always possible to do that type of grant making, but in our case, we were able to do that as well. So those are just some of the responses, but there's a lot more. And if there's any burning questions somebody wants to ask, otherwise I'm happy. As I mentioned, I put my email there. So welcome to write to me, and happy to respond to more questions.
Well, thank you, Shama, so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us. There was so many links shared, so many great questions. I will try to capture everything and send it in a follow-up email. And as I mentioned before, we are recording this, so we'll be sharing that recording in a follow-up email as well. But that's it for today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.